To say that Stadia has had a rough launch would be an understatement. This was supposed to be the platform that would bring cloud gaming to the limelight, but instead what it's done is it's just kind of paint a negative picture on cloud gaming with Stadia's whimper of a launch. The games aren't there, the technology isn't there, too many drawbacks to streaming games right now, the features aren't there, and the business model of Stadia is absolutely horrid, and the end result is that people have not gravitated towards this platform. It has undersold, not a lot of people have signed up to it, and the games aren't coming in, and we've heard a lot from customers and journalists and reviewers sharing their take on Stadia, and a lot of it has been largely middling to negative from what I've seen, and the few positives that are out there, even they sort of understand why there's such an apprehension surrounding Stadia and the way Google is handling cloud gaming. But we actually haven't heard much from developers and whether they're genuinely excited about this platform or if they're apprehensive about it. That is until this Business Insider article. This is an outlet that reached out to a number of developers and even executives who have conveyed their thoughts on Stadia, and the feedback that Business Insider got wasn't pretty. The things that the developers had to say were pretty pessimistic about the current state of Stadia. So the headline here reads, Google's ambitious push into gaming is floundering, and it's due largely to too few games on its Stadia platform. Here's why developers have held back. Scrolling down through the article, it'll highlight some of the issues that Stadia has faced throughout launch and some of the negative PR and feedback surrounding it. It talks about how there's currently only 28 games available on Stadia, and it's been out 4 months, and among those, only 4 fall into the indie category. Indie is an important sector of gaming that fleshes out a platform's library of games. It cannot just comprise of these major AAA releases that come out every so often, and on that front, Stadia has failed quite dramatically, and even just getting any game on Stadia is seemingly a struggle. And as far as why certain developers are deciding to not consider releasing their games on Stadia, well, here's a quote from a prominent indie developer who said, "We were approached by the Stadia team. Usually with that kind of thing, they lead with some kind of offer that would give you an incentive to go with them. But the incentive was kind of non-existent," they said. That's the short of it. So when you're a new platform and you want to pitch a developer to put the extra effort into porting their game over to your platform, you gotta make some kind of proposition, you gotta give them some kind of motivation to do that, but Google and the Stadia team seemingly have done a pretty poor job at that and offered very little really, certainly not enough to make it worthwhile for developers to put the resources and effort into making a Stadia port. And then the Business Insider article noted that it's a statement we heard echoed by several prominent indie developers and 2 publishing executives we spoke with for this piece. And then here's actually a quote from one of the executives they spoke with. They said, "It's that there isn't enough money there, so low that it wasn't even part of the conversation." So Stadia wasn't offering enough cash up front. There is also the fact that Stadia doesn't have a big player base, so there is really not a lot of incentive given that games on Stadia are likely not to sell very well at all due to both the poor business model and the fact that Stadia as a platform hasn't attracted a big user base. And then it reads right here that according to these developers, the incentive isn't solely financial, but it's the main part of the equation. And then another prominent indie developer said, when we're looking at these types of deals, we're looking at, is this enough money where we have the resources to make what we want, or is this an exclusivity deal that gives us security? So as an indie developer, your finances are very important since you're not a AAA game publisher and developer who has all of this money and resources. So they have to consider these deals carefully, and apparently with each of the developers that Business Insider spoke with, they all said Google simply wasn't offering enough money in addition to several other concerns, and one such concern was expressed by this developer who said there are platforms you want to be on because they have an audience and you want to reach that audience. That's what Steam is, or that's what Nintendo Switch is. They have big groups on their platforms and you want to be with those groups so they can play your games. So even if Stadia comes and offers you an exclusivity deal that may grant you a lot of money and gives you some financial security, the sacrifice could be that you're not going to reach that big of an audience, given that Stadia's user base right now is probably in the hundreds of thousands, even months after launch, which is not very many players, and there's not a lot of incentive to buy games at full price on Stadia, given you only gain access to them rather than download them or own them in some way. There's less of a sense of ownership. A developer wants that outreach in order to develop their brand, their video game franchises, and sometimes thinking about that long-term game is more important, and Stadia doesn't offer great long-term prospects on that front in terms of just getting the game out to as many people as possible. Whereas with Steam and Nintendo Switch, these are established platforms with tons of people engaging with these platforms every day. So even if there isn't necessarily an exclusivity deal that's being offered, just having that player base, that audience base that could potentially look at your game is a bigger deal and more important for long-term success. The Business Insider article then highlights how Stadia does not currently have a large audience to reach, and so they have to create incentives for developers, but they've been struggling with that, and the people that Business Insider spoke with said that it's beyond just money. That's a big factor, but outside of money, here's what one developer had to say on that front. If you could see yourself getting into a long-term relationship with Google, but with Google's history, I don't even know if they're working on Stadia in a year. That wouldn't be something crazy that Google does. It's within their track record. That's another major concern that's been brought up about Stadia. With Google's history of killing off so many services and products that they launched that didn't pan out, people are wondering if Stadia doesn't take off, is it going to see a similar type of scenario? There is an entire website here called Killed by Google, dedicated to highlighting all of the services that Google has killed over the past few years, and there is a lot of them. I mean, this page goes for miles and miles, essentially. Endeavors like Google Glass comes to mind. Google Plus was killed off not that long ago, and the list just goes on. And so when Business Insider asked this one developer about a potential long-term relationship, the developer said, how can I see myself in a long-term relationship with Google, given their history with their services and products and how quick they are to kill them off, or, you know, how quick they are to just forget about them when they don't go as expected. And maybe there'd be more confidence if Stadia would have had a really strong launch, but the launch of Stadia was tepid at best. Interest is lacking, and the reception and optics surrounding Stadia currently are very poor. It all just paints this picture, combined with Google's history of killing their services that don't get the traction that they had hoped for, that Stadia is well on its way to being added to this list, with the rough launch that it's had and with the momentum that it's lost. And this whole notion of Google potentially giving up on Stadia is something that was brought up one way or another by just about everyone that Business Insider spoke with. According to Business Insider, quote, this concern that Google might just give up on Stadia at some point and kill the service, as it has done with so many other services over the years, was repeatedly brought up unprompted by every person we spoke with for this piece. They all, without being asked, brought this concern up, and that tells you a lot about what the optics are surrounding Google. And then here's another quote from a publishing executive that Business Insider reached out to. They said, with Google, it's easy to look at them as, well, it's Google. If anyone's gonna make it work, it's them. But they've failed a ton in the past and walked away from major services. Indeed, that is 100% true, and it's a valid concern, not just for developers, but also for customers who are spending money to buy individual Stadia games. If that service happens to be killed off, if Google decides to give up on Stadia, guess what? All those purchases you made go down the toilet because you don't own the games. You are only getting access to Google servers for the games that you purchased, unlike with local hardware where you might have games downloaded and still be able to play them regardless of what happens on the company's end, regardless of factors like internet and whether the services that the company provides are still up. Business Insider also reached out to the Stadia team about the concerns that developers have shared throughout the article, and they actually got a response. Here's what a Stadia representative, Patrick Saybold, had to say. The publishers and developers we speak with regularly are very supportive and want Stadia to succeed. It is also worth pointing out that not every publisher has announced their games for Stadia so far, and more games will continue to be announced in due course. Business Insider then proceeded to note that most of those games are from major publishers like EA, Bethesda, Ubisoft, 2K Games, and Rockstar Games, the ones who can essentially afford to take a risk on Stadia because they're such big companies with a ton of resources, a kind of risk that indie developers might not be able to take. And the fact that Google is unable to attract developers beyond those who can afford financially and resource-wise to take the risk of putting their games on Stadia and seeing what happens. According to Business Insider, that is indicative of a troubled behind-the-scenes goings-on for Stadia. It reads right here, the absence of these games, indie games that are still missing at the launch of Stadia last November, and their continued absence in the ensuing months speaks to Google's inability to attract developers ahead of launch. Finally, Business Insider quoted one more developer who talked about why they decided not to publish on Stadia. They said, "It wasn't just a financial thing. At the end of the day, I'm asking the question, why would I do this? And there was no positive reason to move forward. There wasn't really anything to want us to get in the door other than to be the first on the platform." So that's definitely something you do not want to hear about a brand new platform that's trying to break in a saturated market that is occupied by major players like Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, and the entirety of the PC landscape, Steam, Epic, you name it. Google's inability to convince developers that they have something to bring to the table does not speak well for the future prospect of Stadia, and so Stadia has an uphill battle to face. There's just so many things Google has to overhaul with Stadia in order to make it a good proposition for not just customers, but also developers who are saying there's just no good reason, there's no incentive. At the end of the day, for any game company or developer, it comes down to, is it worth it? Making games is expensive, it requires a lot of resources, it is a business, it is a creative endeavor, but it's also a business, and from a business perspective, Stadia makes absolutely no sense currently. Stadia already felt like a sinking platform, and now to see this, developers expressing such pessimism towards Stadia and their just complete disinterest in releasing their games there, that does not paint a pretty picture. While I have no doubt that Stadia will eventually get the features that were advertised, that it will eventually improve as a service and maybe get to an adequate state, I'm wondering if by then it'll be too little too late, if these developers will have moved on to other encroaching cloud gaming services that are far better value propositions, particularly xCloud, if Stadia will just fall behind while local hardware type of gaming continues to thrive, and while other cloud services just offer better business models and offer more options in terms of both being able to stream games and being able to play the games locally as xCloud will. It'll be interesting to see what 2020 has in store for Stadia, whether they'll be able to make exciting announcements that will rekindle interest. But for now, all I've got to say is, man, do I regret investing $130 in this platform due to how half-baked the launch was and due to how naive Google was expecting that they could release this early access product as if it were a final release and expect people to flock to it. It is cool technology, but it hasn't been implemented in a way that is filling a void for customers, for the mass audiences, for gamers out there. I still think cloud gaming is waiting for a company who can do this right with the right amount of games, the right features, and the right business model. Stadia just ain't it, for now at least. This is one man's take on the situation, and seemingly a lot of developers and publishing executives feel the same way. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on the information conveyed in this Business Insider article, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.